Hiking, camping, riding. There are a number of ways to enjoy exploring the wilderness. But do not believe for a second that you can outrun, outdrive, or hide from the horrors that lurk out there. Be prepared to be stalked by the unknown and scarred for life when you find something in your tent that isn't human or at all natural. Enjoy these allegedly true scary stories about people who encountered terrifying things while exploring the woods. Remember to send me your scary stories so I can narrate them. Just go to darkstories.org or eeriecast.com. Now let's begin. Something lives near my home. From Anonymous. I live in Tooele, Utah. Many of the people who know me know that I love to visit the mountains by myself. Well, I'm not really by myself though, because I always take my Cocker Spaniel Dax with me. Our house faces east, and there are mountains there and to the south of us. I've always wanted to visit the ones in the east, but my parents have said no. It's a miracle I was able to convince them to let me visit the ones in the south. I've been to those mountains many times before, so whenever I go, I know my way around pretty well. I have certain landmarks, you see, such as a pine tree I call the Christmas tree, or that one deer trail in particular that I always take, or the meadow full of yellow flowers I once found. Either way, I know my directions, so I never get lost. Except on one occasion. It was the last time I ever visited those mountains. I left the house that day, thinking I was going for a walk. I live in the middle of a nice modern neighborhood. I was walking around the place when I saw the mountains in the distance. I wanted to go to them so badly. I asked my mom in a text if I could go, and she responded by telling me that I basically had 2 hours. I was overjoyed. The place I live has a lot of fields near it, and then of course all those mountains. In front of the mountains east of my home there is a field called Angel's Grove. Running south alongside that field is a dirt road that leads to one of the richest places in Tooele, Cassidy Lane. On Cassidy Lane, right before the last huge house, there's some sort of mechanical shed. This has a short gravel road that leads to it, and directly behind the shed, the mountains start. I was determined to have as much time as possible in those mountains, so I ran all the way up the long dirt road to Cassidy Lane. When I eventually reached the mechanical shed, I was out of breath and exhausted. So was my dog, Dax. We climbed steadily up that hill behind the shed and started walking left alongside the hill, toward the east. When we had gotten all the way around the first hill, we were facing south. Now, if you were to look directly at the mountains I was in at the time, the ones directly south of my house, all you would see would be the first few hills. These hills are minuscule compared to the hills in the east, but not small enough to see behind them. But behind those hills are many smaller ones, so when Dax and I got around the first one, we had many to climb over. We climbed over several hills and saw all the landmarks as usual. There are plenty of cougars in the mountains near my home, so I was on edge. The very first time I went into the mountains, I saw a 2-day-old cougar print. Every so often, I would stop and listen, making sure nothing bad was there. To top it all off, I've heard a lot of horror stories, so naturally I'm pretty paranoid. I would stop and listen every 5 minutes or so. During one of these times, my dog was starting to look alert. This put me even more on edge, so I bent down and I asked Dax what he saw. He didn't really acknowledge me and kept staring at one spot in the trees. I was starting to get creeped out. All of a sudden, there was a flash of brown fur. My first instinct was grab my drop-point knife. I named it Buck when I first got it, and face whatever jumped out at me. My hand flew down to my sheath, but before I could take out the knife, I saw what animal it was. There were actually 2. They were muley bucks. They looked more scared than I had been, considering they probably didn't expect to see a person out here in the mountains this far. I yelled and scared them off, because I was angry at the deer for giving me such a scare. I was then suddenly filled with curiosity of what I would find if I went over to where the bucks had been. So I reassured Dax and we walked forward to where the deer had bedded down. It was a small clearing of sorts, the size of a large bathroom or walk-in closet. Naturally, there was a lot of deer scat and pressed down grass, right where the deer had been laying. Dax was sniffing around, and then I saw bones. Now, when you go in the mountains like this, you have to expect some bones. Carnivores have to eat too. The largest bone I saw was approximately 7 inches long, so whatever this animal was must have been relatively small, maybe a fawn. I looked around a bit more, then took Dax and continued my walk south uphill. Dax and I had been walking for a little while when I saw something a bit out of place. Up ahead, towards the east, there was a big, thick stick standing straight up by its lonesome. Thinking this odd, I walked up to it. The ground it was on was a dirt mound, like the sort a burrowing animal would make, or perhaps the mound of a newly dug grave. It looked like the stick had been put there on purpose. I tried pulling it out, but it wouldn't budge. This made me think of the sword in the stone, so I pulled once more and it wiggled a bit. Other than that, I couldn't get it to move much. So I gave up, took a picture, and trudged on. By this time, I was farther up in the mountains than I'd ever been before. This was territory I'd never seen, and I was loving it. I loved the feeling of seeing something new that possibly no one else had seen before. I was thinking about this when a thought occurred to me. There are a lot of homeless people in Tooele because they're forced out of Salt Lake. They come to live on the city streets and some even in the mountains. This is well known where I live. There's actually a different field near my house that has about 5 homeless residents in its trees. I visit there only during the day because there's proof that they come at night. I've seen an open pretzel bag there that wasn't there before, new blankets, a different latrine, and more things added to their stash. I was thinking about this and remembered that the same time I saw that cougar print, I also saw a very well-designed hobo hut overlooking the city. They live in the mountains out here too, and since I'm a teenage girl, I am unfortunately very vulnerable. I put 2 and 2 together, and figured the stick I'd seen was probably some sort of marker or landmark for a homeless person. I merely shuddered at the thought, but kept on going south away from home. I checked the time on my phone. I gauged that I had about 40 minutes left until I had to turn around, so I picked up the pace. Eventually, I came to yet another clearing, except this one was a little bigger than the last. I took about a full minute to stand completely still and just listen. As I listened, I looked around. Suddenly, a flash of brilliant, metallic light caught my eye. What the heck? I thought. I walked over to the thing that was flashing on the ground. When I came to it, I realized what it was. It was a circuit of sorts. I couldn't tell you what type, as technology is not my strong suit. It was about 5 inches across and 5 inches up and down, making it up to be a square. There were batteries on it that looked like dimes, different colored wires, the works. I picked it up and examined it, but couldn't learn anything more about it. Once again, I figured it was one of the belongings of a homeless person. I set it back down where I found it and kept on walking. Later on, I found 2 more disturbing things. One, an open cardboard box that had some sort of squishy substance in a plastic bag, and 2, a trail of small bones that went on for a while. Some unfortunate animal had been dragged by some carnivore and lost some of its bones along the way, I guess. This one seemed to also be a fawn by the size of the bones. I checked the time on my phone again and resolved that it was time to turn back. All of a sudden, I stopped dead in my tracks. I heard a wailing sound from far away behind me in the southeast. I turned about in every direction but didn't see anything weird. I was scared because the sound was extremely unnatural. It was wavering and warbling. It went from one note down to another, then right back up to the same note. It repeated this over and over, and it was so quick. If you listen to a violin and hear the vibrato, it was just like that, except longer. I turned around again. The area I was in was a huge coniferous forest, so I could not see the sun at all. I was in pure shadow. If I couldn't see where the sun was in the sky, I could not as easily tell which direction was which. I was walking in the direction I thought was north, but then I second-guessed myself. I began to look around in doubt. I've never ever been lost in the mountains, but that day I was. I turned to what I thought was south and began to go in that direction. After about 100 steps, I decided not to go that way. It didn't feel right. Come to think of it, no way felt right. I sat down on a rock resignedly and tried to think logically, to think straight. I was, in truth, quite afraid. I was on edge and very jumpy at that point. I very much was lost. I surveyed the trees above, trying to decide if I could climb any of them to see which direction the city was. I saw one that looked easy enough, so I tied Dax off on a sturdy branch, patted his head, and began to climb. Unfortunately, I was only able to climb approximately 15 feet before my arms couldn't reach the branches. I reluctantly climbed back down the tree. I went over to where Dax was tied off and sat on the same rock. Even if I did know the way home, I would have gotten back 3 hours late. I tried calling people several times, but I had absolutely no service. Nada, zilch, nine. I thought through my options carefully and deliberately. I concluded that the best thing to do was try going home one more time, and if I didn't find the way, I would simply have to stay the night. The thought of staying the night in these woods, with all the homeless junkies, and with all the scary stories I've heard, terrified me to the bone. My last search for home was my most desperate. But I didn't find my way home that night. By the time I decided to get some rest, it was basically dusk. I thought about how crazy this was. My family was without a doubt worried sick, and probably going frantic, calling the police, making search parties, and researching anything that could go wrong in the mountains. I felt horrible about making them feel that way. Also, sleeping in the woods at night with only my dog, scary people lurking about, and cougars and coyotes and snakes, and my ever-present omniphobia was just nuts. I get it extremely bad in the mountains. The ever-present dread of evil lurking. I eventually had to deal with the tedious task of finding a secure place to spend the night. I looked everywhere. I looked for a cave that was vacant, or a den of sorts, and I even tried to build a temporary shelter. I always knew I was good at working with my hands, but I never thought that I could be bad at making a simple lean-to. I tried to build a fire, but everything was damp, and I was stupid enough to forget matches and a lighter. You idiot, I thought. I eventually found an enormous tree, near the one I tried to climb, that had a wide enough skirt that I could sleep under it and become invisible. Almost. I had settled down on the cold dirt ground, using my jacket as a blanket and snuggling Dax to keep us both warm. That's when I heard something. It was a low rumble, but then it grew louder and louder, and I realized it was the sound of Dax growling. I felt his chest vibrating under my hand. Oh, you've got to be kidding me, I thought. I whispered quietly, "What is it, boy?" He was staring somewhere into the trees, outside the one we were sleeping under. He proceeded to bark and howl. I shushed him and held his mouth shut, so as not to alert anything that we were there, whatever it was. Dax continued to make loud sounds from under my hands, too loud for my comfort. So I petted him and kissed his now dirty head, and I told him it was all right. Secretly, I trusted his intuition better than my own, and mine was making me very nervous. He continued to stare out into the trees ahead. I looked into the direction he was looking, but since it was nearly pitch black, except for the light of the moon, I couldn't see anything. Then an awful thought occurred to me. What if there's a person out there? or a cougar, or something. I immediately took out my knife, buck, and quietly set up. I scooted back to the trunk of the tree, taking Dax with me, so nothing could sneak up behind us. I knew that cougars could sleep in trees, and that they would be asleep by now, but I still looked above me just to make sure nothing was there. Dax continued to howl, and I was getting mad. I scolded him and told him to be quiet. He whined a bit, but finally obeyed. Slowly, I opened the backpack to take out my flashlight. I turned it on, and I pointed it in all directions. But still, I didn't see any sign of anything bad at all. But then I was petrified. I heard something in the distance, something loud. This was like nothing I'd ever heard before, like the warbling sound, and it made my blood run straight cold. My head swiveled around. The sound was like a shriek of something awful. I could not put my finger on what it was, but I was scared out of my mind. The sound was still in the far distance, but I could tell that it was loud. I was terrified even more than I'd ever been. My hands were shaking as I shone my flashlight everywhere once more. Slowly I got up, tugging on Dax's leash and sprinting over to the tree I climbed earlier. The leaves and rocks I trod on sounded louder than before. It was lucky I brought Dax with his harness on, otherwise he would have been choked by his collar as I climbed up the tree while holding on to him. I wrapped my left arm around his chest, telling him it was all right, firmly placing my backpack on my back, and I began to climb. One foot after the other, one hand, one breath. Unfortunately, I'm not as strong as I'd like to be, and by the time I was about 10 feet in the air, my arms were shaking violently. 5 more feet, I whispered to myself. Just 5 more feet and I'd be safe enough for the night. Dax was beginning to slip, so I made the trip as fast as I could. Eventually, I made it to the spot I wanted to be at. It was a huge, thick branch. I pulled Dax onto my lap, and I sat with my back against the tree. I knew there was no hope for sleep that night, so I kept my flashlight out, just in case the situation got worse, if it possibly could. I checked my phone very rarely, so as to conserve its battery. After a while, my phone read 1:15 a.m. I sighed and held Dax tighter. He was beginning to slip a little. He had dozed off a while back, and now he was snoring full force. I wondered what my family was doing right now, and I wonder if they'd told my friends I was missing yet. I wondered what I would say when I got back. You got yourself into this situation, you idiot, so you'll just have to tough it out until morning, I told myself. I knew I would make it back. There was no room for doubt. When the sun rose, I would be able to tell which direction I was in. Then I would head north as early as possible. Now I'd been thinking quite a bit to keep myself from dozing off and falling out of the tree, but then I heard something, the sound of leaves rustling. I sat straight up, already alert. I didn't hear anything else, and I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. I'm used to this because I have to deal with my mind doing that quite often. I leaned back again with my back against the tree trunk. I closed my eyes and sighed. Then the noise came again, a rustle in the leaves. This time, I sat up slowly, so I could hear if the noise happened again, and it did. By the pattern of the sound, the thing that was down there was walking on 4 legs. This was not a person. At the moment, I was worried it could be a cougar or coyote, maybe a fox or bobcat, but this sounded heavier. Then the sound stopped. I held my breath for as long as I could. When I did finally breathe again, it was so quiet, not even a fly could have breathed louder. There was something down there, I thought. It was dangerously close to my tree. After what felt like ages, I heard the rustling again. It was so quiet, I really had to strain my ears. But something was down there, I was sure of it. I assumed that all my moving around had awakened Dax, because he was beginning to stir. He moved around a bit, but then he fell right back to sleep. That was a good thing, because he would have noticed something was off and would start making a lot of noise. I stayed there, sitting up in that tree, my eyes wide open, for who knows how long, but it felt like hours and probably was. Finally, I began to see signs that the sun would soon be showing first light. I checked my phone, 6:21 a.m. I was grateful that I would have light soon, but the wait was nearly unbearable. I figured I could climb out of the tree a minute or two before I actually saw any light. I thought that whatever had made those sounds in the night was gone. I was so wrong. I was just about to wake Dax up when I heard the most horrifying thing yet. To this day, I can still remember exactly how it sounded. It was so much worse than the mysterious shrieks I'd heard before in the night. There was a sing-song voice from below. I tensed up, and my eyes flew wide open. I knew where that sound was coming from. It was coming from directly beneath my tree. I didn't dare move, or breathe, or do anything. All I could do at that moment was sit still and listen to see if whatever it was spoke again. Maybe it had something to do with basic survival instincts. Moving my head to see under the tree was not safe, nor was answering the call, obviously. So all I could do was sit. Hello? Came the call again. I was absolutely petrified. The sound was evil in and of itself. It sounded like whatever was down there had 3 sets of vocal cords, like there was more than one of them speaking. Its voice was unnaturally high at the same time. It sounded masculine, if whatever it was even had a gender. As slowly as I could, I deliberately inched my hand toward my hip, where my knife was sheathed. I quietly unbuttoned it and gently pulled it out. It was still dark, even though it would be light soon. I slowly drew my knife up to me and held it as tight as I possibly could. Hey, you, came the evil voice from below. I know you're up there. The creature seemed to have an issue with stuttering. It said the last part in a sick voice as if to rub it in my face that I was doomed. I was starting to get more angry than scared. I hated, loathed whatever was down there for trying to torment me. I resolved that if whatever it was tried to speak to me again, I would threaten to take away its miserable life. Surely enough, the call came again. You should come down to me. I was furious. I could feel my face heating up with fear, and I knew that answering this thing could not do any good, but I wanted to do everything in my power to get rid of it. I'm not coming down, I said, my voice trembling, and I swear that if you try to make me, I'll kill you. Don't even think about it. That voice was the voice I used when I was most angry with my siblings, or at least I was trying to make it that way. It was supposed to sound dangerously quiet and level, like the calm before a storm, but it came out sounding more like a scared teenager's voice, considering that's what I was. I heard laughter coming from below me. It wasn't deep or dark, but high-pitched and mischievous sounding, like that of an evil jester, like Hop Frog, one of Edgar Allan Poe's characters. It seemed to find my attempt to sound intimidating amusing. I knew that getting rid of this thing would be harder than a simple threat. I decided that I would take a peek below me, just to see what the heck was actually down there. I figured it was either a person or some evil being playing a trick on me. Cautiously, I moved my head, inch by inch, like in the Telltale Heart. I felt my heart beat faster. I tilted my head slowly to the right and down. Then I ever so steadily bent it so it was facing downwards. I did all this with my eyes closed. I finally slowly opened them. To this day, I regret that. What I saw was disturbing. That thing was grayish in color and naked. This thing was on all fours for sure, but in a way that was unnatural. It was sort of crab walking. Its ugly belly was face up, and its back was facing down to the earth. Its hideous arms and legs were bent at the most disgusting angles. The elbows on a human are supposed to bend so that the forearms face forward, like if you were to sit on an armchair and put your arm on the armrest. But this thing's arms were bent in the exact opposite direction. They were almost backwards. The same thing was going on with its legs, except once again the opposite. Human legs are supposed to bend in the opposite direction from the arms, as if you were to kneel down. But this thing's legs were bent outward. Hideous. I gasped. I shuddered violently. I looked away. Then came an awful sound, as if the thing were gagging on its own misery. I shut my eyes tight, trying to get the image out of my mind, but it stuck to me like cement. I breathed through my mouth, trying as best as I possibly could to calm myself. I had to think logically. I was stuck in a tree. Dax was sleeping on my lap. I had only my knife. And, not to mention, there was a monster just a short distance beneath me, waiting for me to come down. I tried to think of ways to scare off this fiend when it spoke again.
You should come down to me,
it sneered.
Come down.
I was visibly shaking at this point. I decided to try and scare it off as best I could, so I shouted and screamed at it a good number of obscenities and rude names. But from what I could hear below, it didn't budge. I forced myself to peek down again. I looked, and it was still there, looking right at me. I shuddered and decided I would try to throw something at it. But what? I looked all around the tree and didn't see a thing. But then I looked just above me. There, a small branch that looked easy enough to break off. I reached up and grabbed hold of it. I bent it toward myself slowly, then back up. I twisted it, and it finally came off. I took a deep breath and threatened the thing again. "If you don't leave me alone right now, I'll throw something," I shouted. I looked back in retrospect and realized it was a childish thing to say, but all I could think of was having the being beneath me gone. I heard silence. I thought it was ignoring me, until it said something. I couldn't tell what, though. It was an unintelligible muttering of sorts. It sounded flimmy. Then there was laughter. High-pitched, disgusting laughter. I decided that I should follow through with what I said, so I drew my arm back shakily and blindly chucked the stick down to where that thing was. I imagine I hit it, because I heard the thing shriek, long and loud. I imagined it couldn't have hurt that bad. It was a small stick. Maybe I'd only made it angry. What I heard next nearly made me jump out of my skin. Scratching. I heard the thing scratching at the tree. It seemed to want to climb up to me. And then what? I seriously didn't want to know. That thing never did climb up the tree, though, considering the odd shapes of its appendages. For what was most likely 3 hours, I stayed in that tree, not daring to even breathe too loud. At some point, the scratching went away, and the voice never came back. When I felt brave enough, I climbed down the tree and I ran to where I thought the north was. Luckily, I made it out, and I was able to reunite with my family, who had been desperately looking for me. I told them how I'd gotten lost, and I'd even told them what I encountered, and I think they did believe me, or at least they believed I experienced something traumatic. I later did some research, and now I'm starting to think that what was underneath me in that tree was a skinwalker. I don't plan on ever going back in those mountains again. It'll take some time until I feel safe hunting without a partner. Always be careful going into the mountains by yourself. Understand the risks. You never know what lurks out there. Mountain Encounter from Micah. I'm 28 years of age, living in the northern part of California. I used to love outdoor activities like hiking, camping, and motorbike riding in the mountains and rocky places. But after this incident, I think it's time for a change. This is my story. One day I decided to go motorbike riding up in the mountains with my two good friends Todd and Rachel. The mountain we were going to had a well-established trail, with most folks knowing about it, and a lot of people going there as well. Todd, Rachel, and I packed our stuff and gear and headed out to the mountains. We only packed the stuff that we needed, like first aid, sleeping equipment, food, and water. After we got there, we just parked our car and got our motorbikes gassed up, preparing everything we needed. Rachel was wearing a red getup with a red helmet. Todd was in yellow and I wore orange. We headed out. It was fun, riding up and down the mountain slopes, down hills, and meeting people along the way. Whenever we got hungry or thirsty, we just stopped and chilled for a while, relaxing and enjoying the time we had with each other. After our break, Rachel decided she wanted to go alone, and she would meet us at the turning point up in the mountains. Then she rode off on her bike. It was just me and Todd then. We rode our bikes around, doing a bit of sightseeing here and there. We talked about everything, like how Todd really liked Rachel and was going to ask her out after we were done motorbike riding. I was happy for him, because I already knew he liked Rachel. After that, we headed out to the turning point where Rachel said she was going to be. When we got there, she wasn't there, so we waited for a while. But hours passed, and there was still no sign of her. Whenever people passed by, we asked if they'd seen a girl who drove a motorbike around wearing red. But no one said they saw her. After those hours passed, we started to get worried. We decided to head down the mountain and look for her there. It might take a while, but we would do whatever it took to find her. Rachel was a good friend. We would never leave her out there all alone. We rode slow, yelling her name, asking more and more passers-by if they'd seen her. But still, there was no luck. Eventually, it was getting late and dark, so we headed up the mountain. We saw a group of people walking down, so we asked them if they'd seen a girl in red on a bike. An older couple told us that they took a picture with her. Apparently, she had told them she was heading down to the stream for a better look. After hearing that, me and Todd rode our bikes as fast as we could down the mountain to the stream, and we followed it all the way down. We stumbled upon Rachel's motorbike and her backpack. We searched the area nearby, yelling out her name, when all of a sudden, we heard a woman crying and screaming not far from us. We headed towards the noise. We found Rachel. She was crying her eyes out and screaming, covering her face. We ran over to her to comfort her. Rachel was hysterical, shaking and crying. When she did eventually calm down, she looked at us with the biggest wide eyes that a human being could give. We were shocked. We carried her back to the bikes. We were about to drive off with her until we noticed something in the distance. We both looked up and saw a little girl standing next to a big oak tree, turned the other way, facing the woods. We were startled, but we kept an eye on her. Then suddenly, she slowly turned towards us. Scared, we just drove away. Rachel was hospitalized for 2 days. We didn't know what was going to happen to her, but we stood by her side the whole way. Todd, Rachel, and I never went back there again. But Rachel did have her own side to the story. After she left me and Todd, she drove the motorbike uphill to the mountains where the turning point was. She met a lot of people up there. She took pictures and videos with the family members and their loved ones. An old couple she took a picture with asked why she came alone in the mountains, but Rachel explained that she hadn't, that 2 of her friends were here too. After a couple of hours hanging out with this couple going halfway up the mountain, she decided to go sightseeing down the mountain by the stream. She said her goodbyes and left them. When she got to the mountain stream, she followed it all the way down the mountain. There, she took off her backpack and got off the bike. She went around taking more pictures and sightseeing. As she did, she noticed something in the distance. A little girl. She was standing there next to a big oak tree facing towards the woods. Rachel felt worried and afraid that the girl was lost, so she approached the girl. She said to her, "Hey there, do you need some help? Are you lost?" Then the girl began to turn towards Rachel, and as she turned around, Rachel noticed this girl had no face, no eyes, no mouth, no nose, completely blank. Rachel was horrified, not understanding what she just saw, so she covered her face and screamed, saying that when she opened her eyes again, she then saw me and Todd. After hearing her story, I'm glad we've decided not to go back. Something strange in the Massachusetts wilderness. From Anonymous. I live in a semi-rural part of Massachusetts. It was around Christmas time when I wanted to go on a forest walk. It had just snowed out, and it was freezing, so I bundled up and went outside. I walked through the neighborhood until I got to the local park. There's a huge lake there. However, it was frozen over at the time. I brought my phone so I could take photos of the amazing scenery. The trees looked absolutely stunning. It looked like something out of a novel. I was so engrossed in the scenery, I didn't even notice that I'd gone off the trail. When I did realize, I began to panic. I looked around in every direction, but it was all just trees. I started to run south, but my effort was fruitless, as I didn't see anything familiar. I tried calling my mother, but there was no response. I sat down on a large root of a tree, contemplating how to get out of the woods. The forest was lively. Crickets chirping, birds singing. It was all so peaceful. It helped me to calm down again. And I think I fell asleep for a short period. When I woke up, it was dark, and the forest had gone silent. This immediately disturbed me. But what disturbed me more were the footsteps. They were just behind the tree I was sitting under. I trembled, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it would beat right out of my chest. Then I saw it as it came out from behind the tree. A bird-like creature. It was about 6 feet tall. It had a mixture of beige and white feathers. It was a beautiful creature. It sort of chirped at me and cocked its head to the side. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it ran off into the woods at lightning speed, disappearing from my sight. I was both terrified and mesmerized. Luckily for me, my mom had called a search party. They found me passed out with frostbite on multiple parts of my body, and to this day I'm still confused, as dinosaurs should be dead, right? I guess I'll never know what it was I saw that night. That brings us to the end of this episode of Darkness Prevails. More terrifying stories are on the way soon, so subscribe and smash that like button. By the way, did you know this show is available as a podcast called Unexplained Encounters? Just search for, follow, and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. This show is part of the EerieCast network. Go to EerieCast.com for more scary podcasts, such as Freaky Folklore, which explores your favorite monsters, myths, and mysteries, as well as Redwood Bureau, a fictional horror podcast about an agent on the run from an evil secret organization that captures supernatural creatures and entities. Well, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.